Hey everybody, Alex Kapitko here, and this is the Centered from Reality podcast. This is episode number 2, and I'm pretty excited to be back. I think the first episode was pretty fun. Everything went semi-smooth, which is good after taking a few months off. But anyways, thank you for joining me. It is September 30th. It's a Thursday. It's almost the weekend, and October's around the corner. Tomorrow's October 1st. I love October. Great month. Probably because I guess it's my birthday at the end of the month. I kind of selfish there, but also I love the cooling of the weather. The leaves are changing. There's kind of spooky vibes in the air, and it's kind of fun to just embrace the Halloween and the spooky and just see what happens. But anyways, just a little disclaimer. I am still in this place right on the street here, so there's going to be some noise. I am definitely working on mitigating the noise. I think last week it went fairly well with that. So if you hear any random noise, it is out of my control, but for the most part, we should be fine. Also update, the violinist who covers the weekend across the street from me at that restaurant is not here right now. So I guess the universe is sparing me from getting Save Your Tears stuck in my head for like the 10th day in a row. So that's nice. And yeah, there's actually a lot I want to cover on this episode today. The U.S. did pass a plan to keep the government open right at the final hour. I want to talk about that and also get into Krysten Sinema, kind of her background and maybe what makes her tick, because her and Joe Manchin have been kind of a pain in the ass, and they've made this difficult, whether you agree with their politics or not. Then I also want to get into the Germany elections, how that affects not only Germany but Europe. Big switch up in that election, and also some issues maybe that could be more problematic down the road. And last, I just want to end with an Atlantic article about pandemic nostalgia that kind of hit home for me. I kind of had a connection with it, so we're going to talk about those today. So yeah, to start, yippity-dee, the U.S. government is going to maintain keeping the government open. So it's kind of doing the one job I would assume it's supposed to do, but is always more difficult. But anyways, according to BBC and CNN, the U.S. Senate has passed a measure to keep the government funded through December 1st. So not long-term, no long-term solution, just something incremental that can at least get the job done, I guess. So the measure is apparently going to be signed by Biden pretty soon, at least according to an hour ago. And they cut it pretty close, to be honest, because they had until midnight, and here it's 5:45 in Chicago, 6:45, almost 7 in the East Coast. Good, 5 hours to spare. And let's be honest, there would have been some serious issues. Like, we're in a pandemic, so the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, would have had to probably send 43% of their workforce home on unpaid leave, according to the BBC, if this went through. During a pandemic, which is still raging, there's about half of 9/11 died last week every day. So, there's still a pandemic going on, and what happens if 43% of your federal hospitals are being, losing employees? To me, that's not a good sign. Also, museums, national parks, a lot of federal employees in a lot of different sectors would have to go home unpaid. Okay, we are in a pandemic still, and still having some economic issues as well. Do you really want the government to send their employees home? I thought government jobs were supposed to be about more of a safety net, I guess, to say the least, but instead, here we are. So I'm glad. Here, I can rant about that further, but I'm glad that at least they passed this. It's temporary. The Senate, I think it was a vote. Let me see here. The vote was 65-35, with 15 Republicans voting to support it in the Senate, which is good to see. I was getting really furious for a while that Republicans under Mitch McConnell were just kind of willing to be cultural trolls here. Even though this was literally to approve last year's spending, mainly under the Trump administration, some of the Biden administration, it's just wild to me that they were willing to let the government shut down for political reasons. The same thing seems to happen every couple of years. It's like, can't we pass actual legislation to make sure this doesn't happen? We need to hold Congress accountable, because the thing is they seem to feel like they're immune to this, but it's average people that are going to see the long-term effects here every time, and it's not right or left. Republicans, Democrats, socialists, Satanists, they all get impacted if the government shuts down. So let's get over this infighting, but obviously that's easier said than done, like everything else. So it basically seems like Congress did what they do best. 11th hour, they do some half-assed proposal that'll at least keep the ship afloat for the time being. That's good. It's better than the ship sinking. But there's a lot of other issues, man. There's a lot of other issues that still need to be addressed, and I don't know if Congress will be able to because there's deadlines as well. So the U.S. government is set to hit its borrowing limit within weeks. Yesterday, the House did try to do their part. When I say the House Democrats tried to do their part. They passed a bill that would suspend borrowing limits through mid-December of next year. You know, it's not a long-term fix, but it's addressing the elephant in the room. Of course, the measure passed along party lines. It was 219 to 212. And based on that, I don't see it really going much further in the Senate. You never know. But even the Mitt Romneys, who are big anti-Trumpers, they still vote against these type of fiscal spending policies. So probably not going to change much in the Senate. This comes after NPR reported that Janet Yellen, the current Treasury Secretary, said the U.S. will reach its debt ceiling on October 18th. And that's the limit on how much the U.S. government can borrow. So it's kind of a big deal. And so the Democrats in the House do this kind of symbolic bill, probably not going to pass. Obviously, Republicans they don't like to spend when they're not in office. You know, Trump his tax cuts decimated our deficit, just made it so much worse. But then again, the Republicans, once they're out of power, are against any form of spending, even if it's to kind of just sign off on the spending from Trump. I think also the problem is that this is associated with the Democrats' $3.5 trillion, spending bill, which is going to look at climate policy, welfare reform, a plethora of issues. And it's going to go through budget reconciliation, which is going to, of course, require all the senators to vote for it, all 50, and then they can get the tie break from Kamala Harris. That's, again, also easier said than done, because we have Joe Manchin and Krysten Sinema, who have kind of become weird cultural mavericks. I used to and still kind of do respect Joe Manchin. I looked him up. Once in a while I'll read his profile, and he's actually quite good at reaching across the aisle, talking with everybody. He's not great on environmental policy, but I think he is principled at the end of the day. Krysten Sinema makes no sense to me, I'll be honest up front. And I would argue that this should also be a bipartisan issue. I think we need the government to stay afloat, but even, I don't know how this works if even people like Krysten Sinema and Joe Manchin can't even agree with their party. Obviously, the right's not going to. So it's getting interesting. Of course, October 18th isn't that far away, and I really can't see this type of a spending bill getting done by then. There's also the infrastructure bill, which Pelosi keeps pushing off, blah, blah, blah. You also have kind of the civil war now going on between the moderates and the progressives. There's a lot going on. And ironically, a year ago, I would have thought that the Republicans were the ones where the Democrats were just going to sit back and say, hold my beer, let's watch this infighting. But the infighting's become pretty bad on both sides. The infighting is apparently able to spread because now the Democrats are doing it as well. So we're going to have to see how that goes. But there's a lot to do, not a lot of time. Congress isn't really good at getting things done quickly, so we'll see how this goes. And kind of going off of this just chaos in Congress, I've been hearing just so much talk about Joe Manchin and Krysten Sinema. Somehow Krysten Sinema specifically has kind of become a demon of the left and somewhat of kind of a god to the right, which is just weird, based on her background especially. But it's even more weird to me because she barely talks, she barely cooperates, and a lot of fellow senators don't even know what she actually wants. Joe Manchin was getting more attention for a while because he's notoriously kind of this conservative Democrat from West Virginia. So his case doesn't particularly surprise me very much. He also doesn't like committing to big plans. He usually plays the fool in interviews. He obviously doesn't like big spending. He's pro-life, but's kind of laissez-faire about it. Clearly, he has coal industry ties. There's been some nepotism issues with his daughter and large corporations in West Virginia. He's just your establishment Democrat. Sinema, though, to me, is in kind of a weird place. And to me, it seems like she's almost playing games. Manchin, for example, has given specifics. He says he would limit his vote on Biden's spending bill to 1.5 trillion. If they go over that right now, he's not for it. That's going to be a tough pill to swallow for Democrats, but he's been specific, right? Sinema won't even say what she wants. She seems to be like, to me, it seems like she wants to just play the contrarian, the person who's just against the bill no matter what. Manchin, in my opinion, is predictable. He always seems to kind of hold up against a lot of these spending bills, against a lot of these bills in general over the years. Sinema really isn't. Like, there's a couple theories. One, I think she's owned by corporations and she's just counting on a job once she gets out of the Senate. Another is, I think she's appealing to that Trump-Biden voter that kind of likes the cultural grievance and the culture war. But kind of to elaborate a little bit is that back in June, there was actually a really good article on Krysten Sinema in The Economist. I remember reading it back then, and then today I brushed over it again because I think it kind of explains things well in a pretty unbiased way. It talks about how when she first got elected, she was going to be this rock star. She was the first openly bisexual woman in the Senate, one of the youngest women to be elected to the chamber, and the first Democratic senator from whatever district, or from her part of the state for 3 decades. 3 decades. So she seemed interesting. I looked her up. She's an attorney. She wrote some interesting books on collectivism. Kind of seemed like a quasi-socialist, pretty hip, fashionista. Not the way she's acting now, basically, is what I'm trying to highlight. But the article talks about how she kind of became of a Republican crowd pleaser in a way. She's one of the only people who didn't show up to vote to create the bipartisan commission to look into January 6th. She said it was family issues, and maybe that's correct. But it was it's not a good look. It's not a good look. When, they're trying to get a bipartisan commission, they needed her vote, and she doesn't show up. So that was kind of the beginning. She has voiced her support for the filibuster, which has kind of become toxic. I also support the filibuster, so for me, that one wasn't as big of a deal. But, if you're kind of in lockstep with the Democratic Party right now, you kind of need to be against the filibuster. And then also, while almost a dozen senators didn't support the COVID provision, to raise the minimum wage to $15, she's the only one that did a thumbs down, according to The Economist, and what they called a Caesarean kind of just epic show of force, like thumbs down, I'm not going for this. The Economist brings up a good point, though, as well. Arizona's interesting, actually, because Krysten Sinema and Mark Kelly are the 2 senators. Both are Democrats. Both are moderate Democrats. I know my dad told me that he had actually sent money to Mark Kelly, and I also think Mark Kelly's a great guy. His wife, Gabby Gifford's obviously, serious gun issue there. He's seen a lot. He's an astronaut, which is really cool, and he seems like a sensible moderate. And so a lot of people, I think, would think that he is acting like Krysten Sinema, right? He would also be against a lot of these big spending bills. He also would need to appeal to a more conservative base. And yeah, he is a centrist as well. But to his credit, he's kind of voted with Democrats when he's needed to, because I think he understands the severity of this moment and that he needs to vote with them, right? Like, the problem is if the Democratic Party fails right now, the Republicans will use it to gaslight voters in a lot of ways and come back. And Krysten Sinema, on the other hand, seems to almost be like trying to sabotage what the Democrats are doing. And so that's why Mark Kelly, even though he's also a centrist, he's not a thorn in the heel of Democrats, much like Krysten Sinema is. The Economist also has a good quote that I'm going to read here real quick, and I think it explains why she's so confusing, too. So it says in quotes here, "Blue dog Democrats, like Mr. Manchin, whom she claims as a model, tend to be socially conservative, but progressive on economic policy. She is the opposite. Even as the right has largely abandoned its interests in economics for the culture wars, she seems to follow." I think that's true. I think that's true. I think that this is exactly what this is. It's the culture war. Mark Kelly may be a moderate if he's in a purple or even a red state, but he's doing better with Democrats. He's still popular amongst Democrats in his own state because he's doing what Democrats expect him to do. Democrats mainly voted for him. He's a Democrat. He's going to do Democratic things. But Sinema is weirdly not super popular with Democrats and also kind of popular with Republicans. The Hill reported just today that Sinema is viewed favorably by 1/3 I butchered that. The Hill reported just today that Sinema is viewed unfavorably by 1/3 of Arizona Democrats. 1/3. That's 33% of your own supporting base doesn't like you. And also, from what I've seen, only 48% of Republicans don't like her. That's interesting. This Hill survey found that 48% of Arizona Republicans viewed her unfavorably, with 40% having a more favorable opinion. I know this isn't going to get her over the top if there was someone else running against her that was a Republican, but to me it's interesting that 1/3 of Democrats are unfavorable of her. Only about 50% of Democrats actually like what she's doing. But 40% of Republicans are fine with what she's doing. That's weird. And now for her defense, just to play devil's advocate, she's in a weird situation. Arizona has been a red state for a long time. It did well with Trump in 2016. There's still a lot of Republicans who don't like the Democratic Party there. They also didn't vote for Trump this time, I think because of his toxicity and his remarks on John McCain. But they don't like Democrats either. So for her defense, I think she's in a very weird place, right? Like she's trying to balance a multitude of sides. But this contrarianism is making no one happy, and I feel like she will get primaried no matter what, because who likes her if you're kind of around 50% with Democrats, around 40% with Republicans? What's the damn point? And something else I've kind of thought about, again to be devil's advocate for a second, is that I wonder if Manchin, and maybe Sinema, but more Manchin, I wonder if they're just kind of taking one for the team here. I am sure that not all of the U.S. Democratic senators... Sorry, we got a car going by there. That was kind of loud. But I can't imagine that all of the 50 U.S. Democratic senators agree with all this progressive spending. And part of me thinks that Joe Manchin's the one who's kind of taking all of it to the dome, basically, when there's a lot of other people that probably agree with what he's doing. That's one of my theories on this. Sinema, again, I really don't know, but Manchin could make sense. But the interesting thing, though, is that the outcome of Manchin and Sinema's opposition to basically everything that Biden's plans are pushing for and the Democrat-led House and Senate are pushing for has been fascinating for me to watch, because moderates, even like Chuck Schumer, who I've never thought was some radical progressive, they're kind of now adopting more of these progressive agendas, and they're rallying against Sinema and Manchin. It's interesting. Like, these kind of contrarian moderates have actually brought together the moderates and the progressives in the party. Like, to me, it seems like the progressive wing is actually growing. And it's stupid. If that's your tactic, is just stall everything so the moderates become more progressive, then I think Manchin's plan has failed. As a moderate myself, I want to hear solutions. I want to hear ideas. But instead, moderates like Schumer are being forced to side with the progressives because, again, I don't hear Manchin or Sinema pushing out alternatives or better ideas. It's just, well, we need you to come down to here. And it's like, okay, but if everyone's rallying against this policy at the way that it's been crafted right now, and a lot of the American people support it, like a lot of the American people highly support these. And where's the alternative? So, of course, Chuck Schumer is going to start adopting AOC's policies or start agreeing with her, even though they're in different houses. But still, it's insane to me. It's insane to me. And the last thing I'll just add on this topic is that I know there's never Trumpers. I guess I'm kind of one of those. But could there ever be like never progressive Democrats or never Biden Democrats? I'm going to work on a better term for that, but hear me out. It makes me wonder if people like Mitt Romney and Joe Manchin are the same thing. It makes sense to me. Both are liked by the opposite side because the culture war is somewhat superseding politics. It doesn't matter if Romney votes with Republicans most of the time, or he even voted for Trump's policies most of the time, or that Manchin does actually the same thing as well. I think what matters is it's more metaphysical, To Republicans in Arizona or that watch Fox News, when Manchin or Sinema go on there or they're covered, they seem to be against the perceived idea of a progressive takeover of the Democratic Party. And Romney, to people like me, or to other moderates, they just see him as being against Trump. He speaks out against Trump when no one else does. Even if he voted for the policies of Trump, he still speaks out against him. And that's the same with Manchin. Manchin usually ends up voting and going along with what Senate Democrats want to do. But he's the one that goes on the Fox News shows and criticizes parts of the plan, and it makes Republicans think that there's someone on the other side that they can hear. And I think in the same light, when Romney criticizes Trump on CNN, it makes a lot of Democrats feel good. I don't know. That's just my thoughts on that. So it's pretty bad when I want to talk about an international issue just to forget about what's happening here. But anyways, I want to switch gears and go over to Germany for a moment. Basically, in a nutshell, Germany had a recent election last weekend that really changed German politics, I think, and might hopefully be a canary in a coal mine for something positive in Europe as a whole, but also potentially negative as well. So just a background. Last weekend, Germany had their federal elections, the highest position being German Chancellor, basically the leader of Germany. And this was a role that Angela Merkel has had since 2005. So she had quite a domination of German politics for a long time. And arguably, she was instrumental in kind of the transition from being a pretty poor country to a big driver of affairs in European politics and economics. So she announced earlier this year that she was not going to seek another term. And so what happened instead was that the opposition party to her, the center-left Social Democrats, narrowly won. And this is kind of big because Angela Merkel's party, was the Christian Democratic Union, which is considered to be, I guess, center-right. But I want to make it clear to American listeners that that's a pretty loose term if you're used to American politics, which have always leaned more right than European politics. The CDU, or Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, it's honestly pretty centrist, a little right-leaning, a little more religious, a little more in favor of the free market. But you could honestly say they have a lot of Joe Biden politics as well if you were trying to do a loose comparison. Like, it's not very right-wing. Anyways, but this is big because, this left Social Democrats party did end up getting the majority. It was close. According to The Economist, the Social Democrats rode a late surge to 25.7% of the vote. That's 1.6 points ahead of its conservative rivals, Merkel's party, the Christian Democratic Union, and its Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union. So now Olaf Scholz, the SPD's, or the Social Democrats party, he's now the candidate who's going to be replacing Angela Merkel as chancellor. So this marks, an ideological shift, but a few interesting takeaways for me right away is looking at these numbers. 25.7% of the vote. Imagine if Trump or Biden got that. It complicates elections. How does someone, to me, become a chancellor or a prime minister or a president when they only have a quarter of the national vote? Now, I'm not an expert on German politics, and I know there's a lot of coalition building that takes place. But that's not a great number if you want to have an authority over the entire country. Anyways, I'll digress on that one. So this just right away, for the first time in almost 2 decades, a center-left party is now taking power. But now many experts on this election, including the staff at The Economist, think that this wasn't really great. They said that because there isn't a significant winner, coalition building could be hard. And like I mentioned earlier, 25.7% was the winning party, the Social Democrats. And they were only 1.6 points ahead of Merkel's conservative party, the CDU. To me, that's really not much of a mandate to rule. But anyways, the SDP did win by a close margin, but there's a bigger issue in which the share of the vote in these national elections is kind of not representing a majority anymore. There's an interesting number here that I have. In simple terms, it's hard to form a coalition because, according to The Economist, in 1987, 82% of the vote inside of Germany was between two major political parties, right? Much like the U.S. here. It's the majority of voters vote for Democrats or Republicans. And obviously you're going to get people that go green or libertarian or whatever it may be. But now, in the recent election, the one that just happened, below 50% was shared between the center. So the two biggest parties in Germany got less than 50% of the population's vote. And it makes sense because I'm looking here. 25.7% of the vote went to the party that now is going to become the ruling party or the leading party in Germany. So if they got 25.7% of the vote and the CDU was 1.6 points behind, that means there's less than 50% of the vote. And it's really hard to have a mandate and to keep a country together when you have that much of a barely majority actually now deciding the decisions inside of a country. I know Germany's Green Party was also doing very well this time around. To me, it shows like there's a lot of splintered parties that have broke off from these main two. So now people think that there's actually going to be a need for a three-party coalition, which is going to be hard. Again, like obviously you could probably have the SDU and the center-left party under Scholz try to do some coalition, but they still don't have much of a mandate. So they're going to have to bring in a third coalition party, which is easier said than done, and they need to do this by Christmas. So it's going to be interesting to see, because then you have fringe left, fringe right parties, and you have a younger generation that seems to be kind of unwilling, actually, to accept this system as functioning for everybody. So I don't know if this is a democratic fallacy, if this is if this is a uniquely German problem, but it's going to be interesting to kind of watch how this transpires. Then there's the other side of this recent election, right? Merkel's Christian Democrats have experienced major losses. I mean, in the U.S., this kind of happens where if Democrats are controlling the presidency or all parts of government, then in the midterms or in the next election, a lot of people want to give the other side a chance. So I guess if the CDU has controlled politics now for the last 15 years, maybe it's time for a change. I can understand that. But I would argue that Merkel could be credited for kind of bringing Germany back from the brink following the end of the Cold War. And there's a good CNBC article that has also graphs that kind of display this in a really good manner. It's called From a Sick Man of Europe to a Superpower. These 5 graphs show how Merkel changed Germany. And the article shows how Germany was once seen as a burden on Europe. But now their export-oriented economy, which was once dependent on manufacturing, it's grown steadily. And now their economy has surpassed both France and the United Kingdom. The article also looks into the unemployment rate, which has fallen while Merkel has been in office. It was 11.1% in 2005. Now it's 3.8%. Or at least according to 2020. I'd imagine those numbers might be a little bit worse. But that's according to the World Bank. But obviously COVID has reshaped a lot of things as well. Though Germany handled it fairly well in terms of employment. A lot of Europe kept people on payroll instead of making them reliant on unemployment from the government, which is an interesting conversation for another time. But anyways, from what I've gathered, she made difficult decisions. Yeah, she pissed off her own party. Yeah, she fucking pissed off the other party as well. But she made decisions that were necessary, and she seemed to be a very articulate leader. You know, some argue that the austerity measures she pushed on southern European countries like Greece during the Great Recession may have mitigated some of the issues. Now, I know they could have bailed them out, and there's a lot of criticism on that as well. But she always had a measured approach to a lot of affairs that pissed off people on both sides. Now, I think the problem comes from 2 parts that we've actually seen kind of come to fruition over the last couple of years. One was her lack of investment, not in just infrastructure, but in the general German economy. Economists think that Germany had been too cheap in many ways and was penny pinching, right? That could also explain why they called on austerity measures for Greece. But they were penny pinching during the economic crisis of 2009. There is criticism that they should have borrowed more when interest rates were so low and the economy was in the tank. You know, Germany wasn't that poorly hit at the beginning. And they also have decaying infrastructure that I think we saw. Remember those floods back in, I want to say it was in July? Those floods showed that a lot of German infrastructure was crumbling. And there's also this talk about the lack of spending in government. And they also say that her government's curtailed borrowing and spending at a time when it could have been borrowed cheaply. So, but to me, is that Merkel, or is that kind of the Northern European model of austerity and hesitance towards big spending? To me, I'd say it's the latter, not the former. But again, there's a debate to be had there, and I'm not, again, an expert on German economics. But to me, that sounds like that's kind of how the Germans have approached it for the last couple decades. But to me, the bigger issue, and I think what may be kind of highlighting a bigger trend here, is the Syrian refugee crisis. It worked out pretty well in the long run for Merkel, taking in over 1 million refugees. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm trying to say so many things so fast here. It was a bold move that didn't backfire. I remember when it first happened, I thought there would be just kind of a clash of cultures, to be completely honest, going on. But it didn't seem to come to fruition, at least on some fronts. I think it did create resentment and racial tensions inside of Germany, not from the refugees, but from native-born Germans, who now had this other that was coming in to take their jobs. A lot of these German far-right parties that came out of this time adopted a very similar message to Viktor Orban in Hungary. There's a far-right party called the Alternative for Germany, or the AfD, and it gained a lot of support during the 2015-2016 time. Germany also saw a rise in hate crimes and neo-Nazi dialogue and movements. I think what happened here is that this influx of immigrants polarized society and created a resentful anger. Madeleine Albright's book on fascism, Anne Applebaum's book on fascism, and Twilight of Democracy, they talk about how you need to find someone to blame your problems on. And I think that was the miscalculation that Merkel's government had, was that many immigrants coming at one time. It wasn't bad for the immigrants as much as it was bad for kind of a lost part of the population who was already nostalgic for the past. I was worried, though, that the AfD actually in this recent election was going to do better. But luckily they only got 10% of the vote. But again, 10% of the vote in a big country is a pretty fairly large vote. But I think that that's one of the issues, is that, like a lot of the world, older white populations are having problems dealing with a changing society and an influx of people that are different. And Germany's, I think Merkel's just the scope of her immigration and refugee program, I think it kind of forced a lot of Germans to face that quite quickly. So we'll see. But anyways, to wrap up this German part, I think this election marks a big change for me because I keep seeing worries that Europe is becoming more and more authoritarian and right-wing. Obviously, this is true in Hungary and Poland. Yes, there's Vox in Spain. There's the Brexit movement. There's the Northern League in Italy. All kind of quasi-fascist movements, But this shows to me what happened in Germany, that maybe there's an alternative. There's a resurgence of some form of deliberative liberalism. My hope is that this centrist government can be formed by Christmas. We'll see if it happens. But I really hope this government can be formed and that they can work together. I think it's going to take center right, center left, and I think it's a model for how a lot of Europe can hopefully follow up here. I remember reading about Greece I think it was from 1967 to 74. They had a very oppressive right-wing military junta or military government, and finally they lost power. They were overthrown, and a center union was formed between moderates on both sides. This was a response to, the right-wing military government. It was kind of a bulwark against the extremes. It was people who couldn't agree on everything, but they came together because they understood that maintaining an open and free society was more important than all the bullshit that sometimes comes with tit-for-tat politics. Anyways, I'll spare you guys on that. Before we go, I just want to talk about an article I liked. It was in the Atlantic. It's called "Why Are People Nostalgic for the Early Pandemic Life?" It's by Morgan O'May and Krysten. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of those names. But I found this article interesting because it kind of goes over a trend on social media that is currently happening in which young people are feeling nostalgic for the beginning of quarantine. Or what I mean by the beginning of quarantine, those first few months, March, April, when everything locked down and people were kind of reinventing themselves, terrified, staying home. People were dying as well. Unfortunately, all of that. It is interesting because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Not in the sense that I'm like these other people who have maybe been posting TikTok videos or posting songs about the beginning of quarantine. But I feel it too. The beginning of quarantine, when I was in Spain, I remember life just kind of changed overnight. There was a time when, none of us knew what was going to happen. We were forced home to reinvent cooking to try new things, maybe worry about finances, to watch some Tiger King or read some new books that we never got to before. Maybe we ate too much. Maybe we stressed about work. Maybe we broke up with a significant other. Maybe we had family issues. Maybe we got into a workout routine. But in general, it was a strange time that felt like kind of a weird glitch. With the world being so crazy, I think some of us, and myself included, kind of missed the almost idea of the metaphorical lockdown. The simplicity that it brought, where you couldn't leave your house, your social interactions were limited, but it kind of just brought you to a very simple existence. We were just stuck at home. My theory as to why people are kind of feeling what the Atlantic's talking about is an early pandemic nostalgia is because the world's crazier now. And it seems more hopeless than ever before. Politics is broken. Climate change is worse. It seems like the pre-pandemic world was almost a different era. COVID and just our time at home, I think it exposed a lot of us to things, but it also polarized our culture more. Maybe people are just longing for that time when the veil of ignorance was still covering us, And just to talk a little more about the article really fast, is the article seems to back up these thoughts I've had. According to David Newman, who's mentioned in the article, he's a researcher at UC San Francisco. He said nostalgia is a natural response to uncertainty. He's also found that on a day-to-day basis, most people feel nostalgic when they're also feeling lonely or isolated. In quotes, he says, whether because of the return of mass, electoral turmoil, or the recent Delta surge, people may be longing for a time when the gravity of the situation hadn't fully set in. That's really interesting to me. Because when I read that quote and I think about my time locked down in Spain, where people say the lockdowns here were hard, you couldn't leave the house unless you were grocery shopping, and it'd be a 600 euro ticket if you did. But I remember when I was at home, I didn't understand the gravity of the situation. We were locked down. A lot of us didn't know how bad the virus was. We didn't know what to do. And maybe that naivety to it made us just enjoy the moment. But it's an interesting psychological dilemma to me. Andrew Abeda, who's a professor at Rutgers, is also cited in the article, and he mentions that nostalgia can help people process traumatic experiences in a healthy way. He says this may be how people make sense of it. Maybe that's the case as well. But I personally think it's just because I think the veil of uncertainty and the veil of naivety has been removed from society, and I think all of us are seeing the cracks, and a lot of us wish, in a weird way, we could go back to the pre-time. Now, I'm definitely not downplaying the tragedy of this. I don't want to go back to the pre-vaccine era when hospitals were full all the time. There was no end in sight. Couldn't see your grandparents. But I do understand the energy of the time. It was different. It was creative. It was nervous. And now I think we're all kind of back to a different sense. But anyways, it's all interesting to me. The world has moved on so fast and so furious. So maybe sitting down and processing it and just feeling a little bit down and nostalgic about the last year could be interesting. Anyways, hopefully we will keep moving forward. Hopefully more people will get vaccinated. I don't know. I don't have a lot of faith in that anymore, but we'll see. Anyways, that's going to do it for today. We'll be back next week. Thank you guys for listening. Again, I'm on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. No, not Spotify yet. Sorry, Apple Podcasts, Podbean. Spotify is waiting for approval. I need 5 episodes. We're on 2. So that'll be out semi-soon. But anyways, let me know your thoughts. Also on YouTube. Next week, we're going to have a guest on. Going to keep it a surprise. And take care, guys. Thank you.